So are we waiting? People are streaming in. So welcome. My name is Andre Marcu. I'm the director of ERCST. And if you're in the right meeting, this is the meeting about border carbon adjustment in the EU. And the last report in this phase of work that we do, the title is a very presumptuous that CBAM need to be aligned with the evolving circumstances. What we'll do is we'll wait for a few minutes because people do stream in and does take time for people to stream in. And meanwhile, what I will do is I will take you through the agenda. So that will take us the few minutes that will take you through the agenda. You will get the presentation from the people that have had a hand in writing the paper. So myself and myself first. And Michael Melling and Aaron Cosby, who are, Aaron is somewhere in British Columbia, very early. Michael is in New York, which is also early, but less early. So after that presentation, we have a number of stakeholder reactions. So we have Kimberly Bodwright from the World Economic Forum. So welcome, Kimberly. Happy that you are in Brussels and you're here in person. Very nice to have you in person. Nathalie Giroux from the OECD.
Nice to meet you. Happy to be with you this afternoon.
Thank you very much for taking the time, and we hope to see you in Paris sometime. I was the OECD, but never managed to. We didn't have the opportunity. My friend, Mr. Steleki from South Africa, I know him as an Article 6 negotiator, but now he pops up on CBAM. So I guess that there is a connection there somewhere. Nigel Purvis from Climate Advisor, Maria Elena Scopio, who is going to help me with my Italian from the European Commission. Thank you. And last but not least, my good friend Sam van der Plas for Carbon Market Watch. We have been working with Carbon Market Watch since I've been in Brussels, so happy that you can be here in person, Sam. Now, we have not done a detour, but we have refocused, if you want, the paper, and I will explain to you very briefly to start with, but it's part of the presentation. But I will explain it to you at the beginning. Before the presentation, this phase of the ETS, of the CBAM work of ERCST had 4 projects. And the last one was really focused on level of effort and comparing level of effort. But what we heard was that there was a really interest to take stock as to where we are. And that's why what you'll hear in this particular report is much more about taking stock and looking at the evolving situation. And the fact that we ended up with a title like this, that also took a while to figure out the title. And last night, I can tell you that about, it was at 9 o'clock, Aaron was trying to change, Michael was trying to change the title, which I resisted. But that's okay. I think it's what behind the title that matters. I have to tell you that it is the closing of a phase, and I'll say this at the beginning, I'll say at the end. I have rarely had the opportunity to work with people that are so intellectually curious and interesting, but also good friends. And if we afford to make this kind of remark, it's because we're having a lot of fun writing these papers. I can tell you that. So if you can put the slides up. Mm-hmm. Okay, so if you can, go to presentation mode. Yeah, thanks.
Sorry, there's a small problem.
Technical problem?
Small technical problem.
All right, while we do the technical problem, you may or may not know that ERCST has been very much kind of at the beginning of the discussion here in Brussels on the CBAM. We used to do BCA work in Brussels, and once a year we would drag friends from European institutions screaming into a BCA discussion, and there was not a very popular topic. But once we had the proposal, when we had the political commitment, obviously this became a different game. We jumped in the very early stage with what I consider to be a very good team. And we had since then 3 different phases of the project, essentially before the proposal, during the proposal, now following the negotiation, ended up in the trilogue. And the last phase, this phase that we're in, had 4 deliverables, and the 4 deliverables were the treatment. There were 2 that were very, not technical, but very current issues, something that was very close to the heart of many of the stakeholders. And that was the treatment of export in the EU CBAM, and you may have seen that report. I hope you all read it. The treatment of indirect emissions in the EU CBAM, and that came out in July this summer before we went into this hypothetical vacations. And then the international cooperation on border carbon adjustments, which came out in the fall. I think they were different. 2 of them were more technical, more focused on issue. The third one was a lot more conceptual, looking at international cooperation and what does it mean and how can it take place. Now, the report that we have here, aligning basically the design of the CBAM or what will come out of the process. We looked for a right word. It was not an easy thing to find the right word, because what we wanted to express is what's coming out of this process, legislative process, from the proposal to when the trilogue ends, in light of the evolving landscape. And there have been changes. We're not in 2019 anymore. I mean, the world has changed quite dramatically, especially in the last year. We've seen incredible changes. So we're looking at 3 things in here. One of them is an evolving context for the EU CBAM. So the fact that we do have an evolving context, and we make the case for that. What are the potential consequences of this evolving context for the CBAM? And then implementing the CBAM in a world of diverse decarbonization approaches. And there is, of course, as always, a takeaway section at the end of this. So with this, I will stop here. We are doing this ballet where we, all 3 of us that have made have contributed to this paper, have taken different parts of it. So I think now I think it's Michael that comes to bat, right, Mike?
Yes, indeed. Thanks, Andre. And I will bear in mind that we pledged to sort of try and be quick and get to the discussion. I think a lot of this is familiar. So my sort of charge in the paper, or my mandate, was to try to bring together and take stock of these changing circumstances. And to be clear, we're not looking so much, I think the discussion around CBAM has been very much sort of inward focused. So we're worried about the stakeholders in the EU, the different positions and different institutions, and what the member states are saying, etc. But really what we're focusing in this paper is more the fact that the world is changing. And to begin with, I thought it would be useful to look back at how the CBAM debate in the past has been susceptible to changing broader or external circumstances, as an indicator that it's likely, or it stands, to reason that it will remain susceptible to external forces and dynamics if it has been heavily influenced in the past. And I think the empirical track record certainly shows that that's the case. So if you look at some of the factors or some of the developments in the past, we've had proposals for CBAMs or BCAs, border carbon adjustments, for almost 2 decades now. If you think back to sort of the mid-2000s, both in the US and in the EU, there was time and again sort of this idea that we should talk about it. Things such as the US withdrawal from the Kyoto Protocol gave a bit of impetus in Europe. In the United States, it was the prospect of comprehensive federal climate legislation and some stakeholder pressure from labor unions and trade associations, again, that sort of prompted some actors at least to propose it, but it never got underway. It never really moved very far for various reasons. And in Europe in particular, there were a certain set of concerns, more than probably in the US. One was, of course, that the international negotiations on what would happen after, the Kyoto Protocol's first commitment period. And so the post-2012 landscape, if you like, we're open. We're completely open, very sensitive, very contentious debates, especially as it comes to including developing countries at some point. And Copenhagen just underscored that in 2009, that this was going to be very difficult. And, whole delegations walking out or whole negotiating groups were something to contend with and worry about. So that was one reason why a controversial unilateral or regional measure that sort of deploys trade restrictions was something that especially Europeans did not want to necessarily explore because they feared it could derail that sensitive process. The next thing is, of course, just as in the early 2000s, the US administration withdrew from one part of the international climate process, the Kyoto Protocol. In 2017, well, already during the election campaign, the US again, the incoming administration and President Trump had signaled that they would do the same with the Paris Agreement. And indeed, they announced that formally, and it did happen at the very end of the 4 years of the Trump administration. So this, of course, again, sort of stimulated some energy in Europe, for instance, that we have to do something about it. We can't just stand by and let the largest economy sort of sit back and let the rest of the world pull on climate change. And not only that, but the Trump administration, of course, also famously or infamously started using trade measures quite indiscriminately against trade partners, levying punitive tariffs under different domestic laws like Section 232, etc., ostensibly for national security reasons. But it was very evident that there was a protectionist underlying protectionist motivation, if you like, and this unsurprisingly begat counter tariffs and sort of retaliation from affected trade partners. So trade relations quickly began to fray and are now, one could argue, at a much worse condition than they've been in quite a long time. And they've never been terribly strong over the last decade or two in terms of multilateral trade negotiations. And finally, of course, both in Europe but around the world, we can see that climate policy is accelerating the stringency, the seriousness, the observation of impacts, etc. All these things are sort of highlighting the need to also deal with potential spillovers like emissions leakage. And what we're also seeing, and this I'll highlight in the next slide, is that not only the ambition remains asymmetrical around the world, and maybe in some cases those asymmetries will expand in the short term, but also the types of climate policy. So the instrument choice, if you like, their asymmetries are becoming more visible. So that was looking back into the past and how changes in the global context sort of open a political opportunity space, if you like, an Overton window for Ursula von der Leyen when she sort of presented her political agenda in 2019, gave her that space to put a border carbon tax, as she called it initially, in her political guidelines, and later, of course, the terminology changed to carbon border adjustment mechanism. And I think it's safe to argue that without some of these changes, that would not have been possible. Looking forward, though, into the current situation over the last 2.5, 3 years since that initial announcement, the world continues to change. And I think one can safely say it changes at a dramatic pace, at a breathtaking pace, and usually not for the better, at least in these last 3 years. One thing, of course, is the inflationary pressure around the world, largely caused by the recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic and the responses to the COVID-19 pandemic. So, monetary easing, quantitative easing, a lot of stimulus packages, a lot of liquidity in the market, facing now supply chain constraints and production shortfalls around the world, partly due to lockdown still. So a strong imbalance between supply and demand of all kinds of products around the world, leading to increases in prices, but also reflecting in other things. So first of all, of course, energy being a prime example, with energy exploration sort of slowing down during the pandemic, not just because of the pandemic, but also because of the increased sort of assimilation, if you like, or realization in the conventional energy sector that decarbonization is sort of the pressures from decarbonization, both policy driven and investor, shareholder, public, consumers, et cetera, driven, is accelerating. So there has been a slowdown in exploration in conventional fuels, and the substitutes or replacements haven't sort of been able to fill that gap fast enough. And we have a surging EU ETS carbon price due to a number of policy changes and other factors in the EU. So we have these inflationary pressures and rising energy costs, and the effects are already, from all this sort of evidence, anecdotal and to some extent data-based, for industry, quite dramatic as it stands. Plus, now we have, since February this year, a really escalating geopolitical conflict that changes the landscape that we've had, sort of the relatively, I think, stable landscape we've had since the end of the Cold War, and is really recalibrating political priorities with the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the sort of fallout of that. And not just, of course, in the relationship of Europe and the Western alliance with Russia, but also with other actors like China. Clearly, sort of relationships are changing, and the relations are getting more, let's say, confrontational and less cooperative than they have been in the past. And this is, of course, recalibrating the perceived importance of different alliances. So Europe suddenly is again a little bit more willing to accommodate US concerns because it realizes how dependent it is on US military and strategic influence and might around the world. And of course, another factor is that the sanctions against Russia, the responses to the activities of Russia and Ukraine have resulted in a dramatically escalating energy crisis as Russian gas, oil, and coal are no longer being exported or accepted in the European market. And finally, and this is something that's really more recent, is what I hinted at yesterday, that we are seeing progress on climate policy. To some observers, even surprisingly, that the US Congress passed the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022. But what is now billed as sort of the centerpiece of US climate policy and really a game changer for the US in terms of decarbonization is diametrically opposed, if you like, to the approach the EU has chosen, which ironically, after the US pushing market-based approaches and economic instruments in the 90s and 2000s, now it's really Europe that's sort of doubled down on using pricing. The ETS is being strengthened. We have the ETS2, we have the CBAM, etc. The US is going a totally different direction given the domestic political economy realities that simply do not allow realistically to expect a federal carbon price, and instead has set very heavily on fiscal incentives, concessionary loans and other support measures for R&D, for deployment of technologies and infrastructure, etc. Some estimates, the Congressional Budget Office, the official sort of number is somewhere short of $400 billion over a decade, but some estimates like Credit Suisse already expect that this in turn will leverage private sector investment in excess of $1 trillion. So really a significant change, a significant development. And this, of course, contrasts very much with the EU, where industry is facing rising costs, especially as free allocation is being phased out. And the CBAM will further increase costs because raw material inputs now that are imported will also have an additional carbon cost. With that, I think I end this part and hand over to Aaron.
Aaron, next to that.
Thanks very much, Michael. So as Michael has so eloquently set the context, the question then that we proceed to examine is, does that set of evolving circumstances call for any sort of a recalibration of the approach to CBAM as it was initially proposed? So we look at, in the paper, 3 different aspects of how that recalibration might play out. First, in terms of the coverage of exports, then in terms of crediting for non-price-based policies, and finally in terms of support for industry. So I'll go through each in turn. Exports, as I'm sure most of you know, the Commission proposal involved no coverage of exports, no rebates to exported goods as they leave the EU market. And that was despite knowing that such coverage could be effective against leakage. We have empirical evidence that including export coverage is a significant aspect of leakage prevention, and also knowing, the EU Commission impact assessment showed a drop of 6.8% in export markets if there was no export coverage, and that doesn't even cover the kinds of damage that can be done to the domestic markets as a result of cutting off export flows. So we know there could be significant damage to not including exports, but we also knew that it would be legally, politically, and technically challenging, administratively challenging to include exports, and that we had time. That we had a 3-year implementation period, we had a very slow ramp up of effect. So the real impact wouldn't hit us for a while. That would give us some time to figure out what to do with exports. However, as a result of the kinds of evolving circumstances that Michael has described, some of those impacts are coming home to roost even now. We have very high EUA prices. We have record carbon costs contained in the electricity prices that those industries are facing. Moreover, piled on top of that, we have the unforeseen circumstance of inflation crisis with gas as a feedstock and a fuel hitting record price levels, with the subsidization of the EU's competitor industries in the United States under the Inflation Reduction Act. All of these things combined together result in a crisis situation in European industry, and I don't think that's too strong a word to use. There are, of course, solutions. I mean, one possible solution is to cover exports under the EU CBAM. As Andre mentioned, we authored a paper in the early spring or late spring, early summer that proposed a way that that could be done in what we deem to be an acceptably risky fashion. Others have also done so, arguing that WTO legality can be at least arguably defended. And we urged, moreover, and I think this is the most important, that one of the objectives in including export coverage in the CBAM not be a pursuit of 100% certainty that WTO legality could be achieved. This is an unrealistic expectation, and also we argued not a pragmatic one in terms of the circumstances. And the circumstances have indeed made, in our view, that calculation even more dire. So the next slide, talking about crediting or non-crediting of non-price-based policies. Again, the proposals, and not just in this case from the Commission, but also from Council and Parliament, foresee no crediting for non-price-based policies, such as the policies that the United States has adopted under the IRA. We always knew there would be countries pursuing different paths from carbon pricing, but the US IRA stands out as a sort of signal event in that it is the largest government climate budget allocation ever committed, and it is strong ambition from the world's largest economy, and moreover an economy on which, as Michael pointed out, the EU is now more than ever dependent as an ally, a strategic ally in the changing geopolitical circumstances in which we find ourselves. There are two sides to this question, and they can both be argued strongly. Arguing against any sort of credit, first of all, and this is the Commission line, any non-price policies that are effective in lowering emissions are already rewarded in that those emissions the lowered emissions result in a lower CBAM fee. However, of course, there is still discrimination. Even if you have a low CBAM fee, you have already paid in the country of origin, unlike the domestic producers in the EU. It would be a methodological nightmare. Which policies would we cover? Who decides which policies we would cover as climate-related policies? How do you quantify those policies? And we know from trade remedy experience that it's not a good idea to have domestic economists making those quantifications. Do we actually debit, not just crediting for non-price-based policy? Do we debit for subsidies, which are another sort of policy? If more importantly, if we do credit for non-price-based policies in foreign countries, logically and practically, we would also have to increase the charge at the border to reflect non-price-based policies borne by EU domestic producers, a policy that would be not only politically explosive, but arguably, in my view, strictly WTO illegal. Arguing for some sort of credit, refusing that credit for non-price-based policies is a punishment for those countries that have alternative approaches to climate change mitigation. Alternative approaches, which it can be argued, are allowed under the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement is founded on nationally determined contributions, and there is no direction in the Paris Accord that says how you shall achieve your contributions, and not rewarding credit to those countries that take different approaches, therefore could be seen as going against the Paris Agreement commitment. Next slide then. Finally, in terms of support for industry, the US IRA really puts things on a different level. We are going to see competition in the production of green materials like cement, steel, aluminum, fertilizers, as the US subsidizes production, as they create lead markets for the green products created by decarbonizing industry. We are seeing a de-risking of finance for the industrial sector in the United States that's going to draw working capital away from the EU at a time when it's desperately needed to finance the decarbonization project. Is the EU approach tenable? We have, as Andre pointed out, as Michael pointed out, a very different approach, a subsidization in the United States versus the imposition of a cost and some protective measures against that cost in the EU. Can the two coexist? Is the EU approach tenable in the face of the US IRA? We argue that it's a false dichotomy to portray those two choices, the two approaches as a choice. The EU doesn't have to choose between, but can in fact impose those costs and provide support. And in fact, it is already doing so. There is some funding already existing in the EU that helps the EU industrial decarbonization process. We have the EU ETS Innovation Fund. We have Horizon Europe. Neither of these operates at the same scale, and neither of them arguably is structured so as to have the kind of direct impacts on innovation and investment in low carbon industrial transition that we see in the United States. So therefore, we argue rather strongly that the EU needs to accompany its carbon pricing project with strong industrial sector support to help in the decarbonization process, something we had previously argued, but again, is made more salient, more urgent by the fact of the heavy subsidization that's going on in the United States. This, of course, is not part of the CBAM legislation, but it is a necessary accompanying flanking policy that will help make the CBAM and the ETS reform as part of the Fit for 55 package effective. So now I pass it over to Andre to do the deep thinking about where all this takes us.
Well, we are now in what is in the paper chapter 4, which kind of tries to bring all this, if you want, at a higher level of showing that in our view, this discussion that we're having now, the point that we're now is not the end point of the discussion of CBAM, the trilogue, and that's it, and we go home and we'll see what happens. It is rather, in our opinion, opening the door to the next chapter, because this is going to be an evolving and continuing debate. And we'll make the case for that. First of all, is heterogeneity here to stay. Now, CBAM is part of an evolution for industrial decarbonization. We started with ETS and free allocation. Now, that had a sunset for a variety of reasons. There were different agendas at play, and different people, had saw the CBAM as a solution. But we moved from one thing to the other. There's no doubt about that. Now, the other thing that we also want to accept the fact is that CBAM on its own makes no sense. I mean, I'm not going to introduce a CBAM for the sake of introducing CBAM. Is a companion to a carbon pricing exercise, is a companion to the ETS. In our view, the main drivers are domestic for introduction of CBAM, but were made possible broadly by changing external environment. And Michael has spoken to those external changing environment. And those continue to change with different national approaches. We have seen that we had the EU CBAM, and then a number of other jurisdictions were starting to look at introducing their own border carbon adjustment. But now we've got the IRA, which is kind of puts two very philosophically different views. One of them is pricing, the other one is subsidies. Now, neither of them is totally clean, meaning there's only unidirectional, but the amount of, there's money in the EU programs, but the money that comes to EU programs compared to the money in the IRA is just a different scale and a different type of approach, if you want. It's not 60%, it is 100% for a long term. So the question is, are there more to come? Are we going to see more ideas? Let a thousand flowers bloom, and what will happen? We have no idea who's going to come up with what. And can they coexist? Is there two things that can continue to work together? Or in our view, this is going to be something that you're going to have to reconcile. And is the CBAM going to stay like this? Is that going to evolve? Is the IRA going to stay like this? Is it going to evolve? Are there going to be others? Next, please. Now, the second part of this discussion is the CBAM in a world of diverse approaches, and the CBAM and the Paris Agreement. In the end, Paris Agreement and the UNFCCC is the place where you negotiate or you reach a global consensus on climate change. We all wish it would be swifter and less convoluted. And I'm going to Sharm el-Sheikh, and I'm not saying that necessarily as a badge of honor, but I've been to every COP except the first one. So I do have a little bit of experience in this, and I do chair meetings there. But it's quite clear that unilateral measures are mentioned, or what in the Paris Agreement and the Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Kyoto Protocol. So there is reference to that. The other element that we need to take into account, and this is being, I mean, we're not making this because we got up on one morning with Aaron and Michael and we invented this, but they have been brought up in the Paris Agreement, the Substar Working Group under Article 415, the fact that the NDC is a fundamental part of the Paris Agreement. And the question that being raised is CBAM and a CBAM approach in line with the spirit and letter of the Paris Agreement. I'm not going to elaborate here why, because we'll elaborate that in the paper, but it's a question that parties have raised in the UNFCCC world. Now, the fact of the matter is that both in WTO and in UNFCCC, there is no CBAM. There's a discussion in the EU about the legislative proposal. And in a way, going to Sharm el-Sheikh without having a CBAM on the table is probably not unhelpful because there's nothing to shoot at. So that is not going to stay into the way of negotiation, at least in Dubai. It's going to be COP28 in the UAE. I don't know, but certainly it's going to be less of a problem in Sharm el-Sheikh. How parties will react to this, as Drew and Liza, it is too early to tell. And in this case, it's, in the WTO, and Kimberly lives in Geneva, but I'm being told they have been brought, this has been made the object of discussion in Geneva and WTO circles. In the UNFCCC, I know because they've been brought up in contact groups, but in a very, very cursory and light way because there is no CBAM and parties clearly didn't have a mandate. Is it going to change? I can't tell you. I mean, I simply don't know. Is there appetite for somebody to start a real war in WTO and create turbulence in the UNFCCC? I don't know. I don't have the playbook of major trading nations in those fora. But the fact of the matter is that the CBAM or BCAs were seen as non-compliant with WTO. When before they were introduced, we talk about 5 years ago, they were clearly told that, go away with this. This is not compliant with WTO. There's going to be a problem. Why are you raising this? You're creating problems. The fact of the matter is now all of a sudden we think they're compliant. And if we take it further, it becomes possibly not compliant. But then we have now a new element. We have this IRA. I mean, I can't get over the IRA name, but we have this IRA, which is, in my mind, at least as questionable, if not more so, in the WTO or a certain provisions than the CBAM. It is not being raised that strongly. But it's not a minor issue. And the issues that are being raised, I think, are not necessarily central. They're details, but the whole concept, for some reason, has not elicited a strong discussion so far. Next, please. Now, in what the future holds, in our mind, this is going to be a continuous discussion for the next years, because this decade, the ETS and carbon pricing is going to be an element, but in Article 6 is going to be some element somewhere. How important it's going to be, we have no idea. But the fact of the matter is that trade and competition and climate change in a world of increasing NDCs and increasing ambition is going to become a lot central. And the discussion is going to go around two axes. One of them is the continuous improvement of the CBAM. There's going to be a review. We're going to include this. There's probably things being kicked down the road, and we're going to have to look at it. We're going to have to look at what happened over the first 3 years, et cetera, et cetera. And the need of coexistence with other approaches to industrial decarbonization. So this, if you want, this alignment between right now the two approaches, CBAM and IRA, are these going to give birth to friction? And another question that one has to ask, and I think that some of my colleagues were not very convinced at the beginning, but I think that it is a discussion or a question that needs to be raised. Is there a parallel to stop the clock, the aviation bit? Is there? So you got to look at this to a number of, at least we looked at this to a number of angles. Is the surrounding environment the same? No. Climate change is a very different societal issue right now than it was when the international aviation was introduced. And I think, you know, kind of attacking this is probably going to be less appealing to people than the aviation part was at that time. At least that's the sense we have. Are they similar in nature? You could argue they're not dissimilar in nature. I think they're both applying things to things that originate or take place partially somewhere else. Was there a happy ending? You know, is ICAO happy ending? Is Corsia happy ending? I think it's too early to tell. I think we're a little bit disappointed. Maybe it's not as what people had hoped initially. And the last two slides are about takeaways. Now, in this case, the number of bullets that we have here from the climate change asymmetries are, at least in this point, we talked about climate change asymmetries in the point of view of level of ambition. But we finding out that the climate change asymmetry comes out from the level of ambition, but also how do you address certain things? And the CBAM and the IRA is a case in point. In the symmetry is this choice of instrument. Is other takeaway is, will the CBAM as currently proposed be sufficient to avoid the industrialization? It is not, you know, people have been looking at, and you know, we've been doing studies in different hats that I wore over the years about carbon leakage. Either carbon leakage is carbon leakage, and the answer is no, there is no carbon leakage. But now what we're seeing some very real industries kind of going through a very, very challenging time, whether it's fertilizer or the aluminum. Now, it's granted that, you know, the answer is going to be, why are you talking about this in the ETS and CBAM? Talk about under energy prices. It's not an unfair thing to say, and I think it needs to be said. Now, in terms of EU free allocation to be phased out, we may need additional tools to ensure that European production remains competitive. So this goes into the part of the book where we say that the CBAM is going to need to be continuously looked at, and they're going to need to be complementary measures, whether the various funds that come out are sufficient, or they were going to have to be relooked at in the context of what's out there, because what's out there is the IRA. Now, it's not that IRA, it's this IRA, but there's an IRA, and it's very serious money. Now, so the importance of external circumstances in shaping the CBAM and the whole ecosystem around CBAM cannot be ignored. So we need to look at the CBAM and the details, and exports in 2025. I don't know what's going to happen in the trilogue, but this continuing look at the changing environment and what's out there, I think this is going to be something that we need to take into account. And the last slide, I believe that was the last slide. So there is this two-pronged approach that we talked about. One of them is in the near term, where we need to look at the inclusion of exports. Is this something the scope of the CBAM in the context of choices of policy instrument and the need for accelerating support for industrial decarbonization? So that's one thing. In the long term, there is this convergence between different approaches in different jurisdictions. And there are issues, I think Aaron and Michael have highlighted, policy crediting, including of indirect emission. And is this in the end, this border adjustment, all these policies, as if you want confrontational approaches, very unhelpful, and that you do need to look at a cooperative approach. Now, easier said than done. This is like having new and innovative approaches. You don't sit down and have new innovative approaches, you come up with something. But the fact of the matter is that what we think is going to happen is that the only reality is going to be a changing environment, and that the CBAM and the ecosystem around CBAM is going to have to be nimble, flexible, and adapt to this continuous world. Now, I don't know what you guys think about it. We're very proud of it, but we'll see what the reaction of what the people say. Now, let's go to Kimberly first and see what Kimberly thinks.
Thank you, Andre. So at some point in that very, very good presentation, and congratulations on both the presentation and the paper, you said, does CBAM and the IRA need to coexist or reconcile? And I think we need to add into this conversation, or how do we manage the conflict? And I'll get to that as I talk through my reactions to the paper. I found that there was a key sentence on page 6, so I will encourage you to look at page 6, where you write, whereas European emitters face a private cost for emissions under first best policies that maximize benefits to the public, US emitters are able to secure private benefits for decarbonization funded in the form of a public cost to taxpayers. And I think that really demonstrates how there are completely different thinking and approaches on how we achieve decarbonization and who is bearing the costs and who gets the opportunity, because decarbonization is not only about losses, it's also about opportunities. Then I think I really agree with you on the statement that this is not a false dichotomy. So you don't actually have to have one or the other. You can have both. And I think you pointed out where the EU perhaps needs to do some thinking around this. And there's also the obvious question of, will the US ever consider using federal carbon pricing? You very clearly point out that the unpredictability of US climate policy, and those that have watched that, for those of us that have watched that, know that that is probably quite unlikely, but it cannot be absolutely ruled out. Who knows? The future is unpredictable. So again, these are not two dichotomous policies, but the question is then, how do you dock them together? Going back to what I just said, is this coexistent? Is it reconciliation? Or is it about managing conflict? Now, the actual politics of docking these two different approaches and the way that the two different political systems work together, the difficulties of doing that are evident in past relationships that, again, you point out, or you allude to in the paper. So if we look at how the EU and the US are managing the global arrangement on steel and aluminium, there's a reference to restricting market access for non-participants that do not meet the standards for low carbon intensity, but they do not explicitly mention BCAs. And we haven't really seen a lot of clarity on how that working level content is moving forward. So there is sort of, at least from my sense, a bit of a concern that at least reconciliation, being able to mirror and match these two policies is going to be very, very difficult. Perhaps at best, we will see them coexisting. But I think the reason why I say the need to think about conflict is if you don't have coexistence, you then end up in a situation of conflict where we essentially have Boeing Airbus played out in the clean tech space. And that brings me to another question I have, which is, ultimately, can you have ambitious climate action without stable trade relations, whether those are stable trade relations at a bilateral level between the US and the EU? And just to recall that the US is 18% of global emissions and Europe stands for 17%. So this is still quite a large portion of emissions. We know that Asia stands at 50, 60%. They're a big part of the equation. These are still two very significant players. So if these two players are entering into a dispute at the WTO of the portion of Boeing Airbus, and then maybe spiraling out beyond that with kind of real market consequences, is what happens to climate action? And again, I don't necessarily think that that means that climate action maybe gets totally derailed, but it's worth at least thinking about what are the consequences of that, to then go into the question of how do you adapt CBAM, how do you encourage those two players to engage with each other diplomatically? So the other question I had following on from that was, what is the end result of industrial commercial conflict on climate action? And then I think we also all know that, just to kind of end on just to add to the coexistence piece, I did think it was very interesting yesterday that they announced the US-EU task force on the IRA, and the meeting will be held as early as next week. So again, I think that is positive towards some kind of coexistence. But again, that's what I'm sort of still somewhat skeptical on where that actually goes. The last thing I'll say here is that as you were presenting, I was thinking of the larger time frame, and I was thinking of back 10 years ago. As you mentioned, we were in the Kyoto Protocol time frame, and the question was whether we would take climate action. It's interesting to me now that we're in a period of how to do climate action. So, and we now, as you say, have these two approaches, and we're debating whether they can coexist, reconcile, or whether they'll be in permanent conflict, and if in permanent conflict, what that means for the subsequent climate action. So then I find myself trying to think, and I have a big outstanding question mark, what's the next 10 years? So if 10 years ago, it was whether we do climate action, now it's how we do climate action, and the consequences then for competitiveness and trade. Where are we in 10 years' time? And that part is not clear to me. And I think that's because there's so much unpredictability. But part of the reason why it's not clear to me is because coming from the Geneva perspective, the WTO is both in a very strong position and also in a very weak position in the way that the members are using it from my perspective. On the one hand, we did just have a successful ministerial conference with the outcome on fisheries subsidies, the first kind of really environmentally focused multilateral trade agreement. You can read those that are greater experts than I on how impactful that agreement will be and whether it's worth the paper it's written on or not. I think it's relatively positive. But will we ever see a multilateral agreement again come out of the WTO? I think is an outstanding question. There is a trend towards plurilateralism, and what exactly that will look like. Will we ever see binding agreements come out even of those plurilateral arrangements, or will they be sort of standard setting efforts to cooperate on best practices and transparency? And maybe that's the direction that WTO and global trade governance is evolving in, which doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't a stronger role for binding agreements at a bilateral and a regional level. And indeed, we'll definitely see a lot of that. But that's sort of the outstanding question is, can the multilateral trade system bear the weight of, as Aaron pointed out, the weight of having to adjudicate on whose climate policy is better or not from a trade and a non-discrimination perspective? I don't think so at this point in time, not to mention, of course, it doesn't have an appellate body currently. So you can just appeal things into the void right now. So again, that leads me back to the question of how much of a problem is that for climate action? Because maybe it's not. You know, maybe this is, if we go back to my schematic of 10 years ago, it was whether we do climate, now it's how we do climate, what's for the future. Frankly, we really need to do a lot in 10 years. So recalling again that Boeing Airbus took 20 years to decide on the outcome. Maybe it doesn't matter, but I think it probably does. So I'll leave it you there.
Thanks, Kimberly. Thanks a lot. Natalie, OECD, you've been doing quite a lot of thinking on level of effort and comparing level of effort lately, and we're trying to follow that process. But do you think, as you think, it's a great paper? You have to say it was a great paper.
It is. Thank you so much for the invitation, and it was really inspiring to read the paper. And of course, the involving context has been also something that we've been struggling with at the OECD. We have to make sure that our monitoring tools follow also the evolution of the climate policy landscape. And I want to take my presentation around two of the main findings of your report. Well, the first one is that policy asymmetries, heterogeneity of approaches continue to be an undeniable reality in climate policy around the world. And then the second point that you have in your findings is that climate policy asymmetry is also a matter of instruments, as Andre just highlighted in the takeaway part of his presentation. So basically our work, you will see in the slides to come, is reinforcing these two statements with the empirical data analysis that we have developed, and helps to measure the extent of this claim. So in this outline slide, I have 2 points. So the first one is measuring the level of effort of countries' climate policy. So I will start with that, and then I will go on to the next one. So we can go to the next slide. So here you can put the other part of the slide, please. Yeah, so this is the main feature of one of our tools. It's a database of climate policies and action that we have developed, especially because we want to measure government climate action. It's been very important to have a better understanding of what governments have been putting in place And we didn't have such a tool at the OECD. And we are also doing this to track progress and to monitor the evolution through time. And also, this is important to do some empirical analysis. As you know, the OECD likes to do some econometrics around climate and economic policies. So the main characteristic of this database is that we have developed and make some research around a lot of official and validated data source, and we have been able to collect 128 policy variables, and we have grouped them into 56 policies. We're covering 51 countries, so the 38 developed countries of the OECD, the accession candidate countries, and the large emitter. And we've been able to do this for 20 years. So we have quite a long time series there, and our data will be publicly available. So if we go on the next slide, this here is just to show you how we have organized the framework for this database. It's extremely well structured. We have policy variables that are categorized into sectoral, cross-sectoral, and international policies. And we have a second kind of categorization by policy type, including market-based and non-market-based policy. If we go to the next slide. So here, the key message from this slide is that the level of effort on climate policy differs significantly across country. And this is confirming one of the first key findings of the ERCST report. So to do that, we have developed two options for measuring climate effort. So on the x-axis, we have policy adoption, so the number of policies that countries are adopting. And on the y-axis, we have a measure of policy stringency. And what we see here is that it's quite heterogeneous. It's going from a bit more than 10 to almost 50% of policy adopted, and the stringency would go from 0 to 10. Here you see that we have quite a wide range also. I would just like to make a caveat here that this is not necessarily a proxy for climate effort and effectiveness, but it's a first step to assess effectiveness. But still, we find that countries that have above average policy stringency and policy adoption were also the countries that were associated with a steeper emissions reduction. And on the next slide, this is another illustration, another way of illustrating the level of climate effort. And here we see on this slide that the level of effort is really different across country. What we have done here is we have combined the two previous measures, the adoption of policy and the level of stringency. And again, it confirms that climate effort differ widely across country. So this is highly aggregated. It's just as an illustration. We're not really using this in our empirical work at the OECD, in our monitoring work, but is to give you a clear picture of what it could do when we are combining this. Now, if we go to the next slide, then here I will look at price-based versus non-price-based approaches and give you a flavor on how we have been able to work around those two set of policies. So here, what is the key message from this slide is that countries have different policy approaches. And this is confirming the second key message of the ERCST report. So this graph here plots the average stringency of all non-carbon pricing policies on the y-axis. And then on the x-axis, you have the carbon pricing score, which is the extent to which countries have attained the goal of pricing emissions at 60 euros. So it's a kind of a benchmark that we are using. And what is interesting here is to compare, for instance, the top left, where we have a focus on non-price instruments, and with the lower right, with the focus on price instruments. And for example, if you have very good eyes, you can see that Slovenia and Australia have almost the same level of effort. That was from the previous slide. But here you see that for the same level of effort, Australia is using much more instruments that are related to a low carbon pricing score. So it's just showing the heterogeneity of approaches that that is possible, and confirming this again. If we go to the next slide, so this is a focus on a specific sector because our database allows us to go a bit more granular. And here, again, we can see that for this sector, there's quite some heterogeneity in the approaches. Again, the top left and the lower right quadrant show quite some difference in approaches for this sector. And then my last slide is just to say that this is starting point. It's work in progress, but it is trying to inform a policymaker about this evolving context that you discussed, about the diversity of approach that exists, and about the heterogeneity that is increasing. What we have seen, and this slide is not showing this here, but is that through time, there's more and more policies that are designed and actions that are put in place that countries are using. So by looking at different approaches, country would certainly continue to explore and expand on the scope of available policies. Of course, this is a work that has some limitation in its coverage and in its applicability. We would want to expand the coverage to new sectors like agriculture and waste, to new policy instruments. We talked a lot about subsidies for clean technologies, rebates and tax credits. Of course, IRA is in the mind of many of us in trying to characterize this. Finally, the geographical scope could be extended to other regions which are important, like Latin America or Africa. It's important to us to make sure that we are complementary to the UNFCCC stock taking, using the categorization of the IPCC sector and informing the stock taking exercise. We know that we won't have results probably before 2025. So some kind of monitoring in the interim is important to fill the information gap. And of course, the next step would be to map these policy with the emission base and go towards some kind of effectiveness of measures, but that is a longer term work. In any case, thank you very much for giving us the chance to present this, and congratulations again on your report and on the clear and important questions that you are putting forward in the public debate.
Very well, thanks. Thank you very much, Natalie. Mrs. Teleki, you're up next. Are you still there with us?
Yes, I'm still here, Andre.
Okay,
good afternoon.
Good afternoon. And look, South Africa, I know many of your colleagues that have been engaged into this discussion. I know South Africans are very much up to speed and they're very knowledgeable on this topic, something that you guys have thought about. So again, put that in the perspective of what we have tried to put together.
Okay. No, thanks for that. May I request not to project my video because I'm operating from home and I'm having bandwidth limitations, if fine.
So are you? Yeah.
Okay.
His
Thanks.
video.
So he's gonna put up his own video?
No, he's not turning on his video.
Oh, okay, go ahead. Sorry, I didn't understand. I thought you wanted.
Yeah, if I project the
ahead,
video, I lose connection.
Well, we don't want that. Go ahead, please.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, and thanks to the presenters, Michael, Aaron, yourself, Andre, but also to the colleagues who have just, made their reflections on this very important subject. And congratulations, for the paper. Our comments, they relate partly to the evolving context. And indeed, Michael has projected that, fairly. And what we would like to underscore that context of focusing on CBAM there's also the aspect of COVID in that many developing countries, including South Africa, were significantly impacted. Of course, we are not the only ones in the world. Everyone else had been affected. The message I'm trying to put across in this regard is that that was even more worse in the case of developing countries. And perhaps also the important point to add is the additional disproportionate, impact to developing countries. Michael makes mention of the growing asymmetries, in domestic, policy, climate policies or domestic climate policy. I'm saying that there's worsening, of that, in developing countries. And also the fact that most of these industries, you'll be aware that it's well known, of course, that the export basket from South Africa and other developing countries comprises mostly of raw and unprocessed, products that go to the EU, which is our, major trading partner. And as such, we view CBAM to be having, an additional impact on that, especially that, Michael, you rightfully pointed at the increased, energy prices and so forth, which is even worse, in the case, which has fueled inflation further in developing countries as well. Now, to add CBAM to that, knowing that the export basket that we do have comprises of the products, as I have pointed out, will drive, developing countries into even dire circumstances in which we are likely to see worsening, indebtedness, worsening unemployment, worsening poverty. So we need to keep in check, of this. And it could be good that some of these likely impacts, especially in your paper, if you are to have another version of it, you point out, on those, and not only focus, on the price, aspect, because there are also other externalities that could be felt elsewhere outside of the EU. Aaron, you touched partly on the potential consequences, and what I may prefer to lift therein is the aspect of the fact that there's been, it has been proposed that there be no export coverage, under CBAM from EU industries, so to speak. So that will that's discriminatory, and as such, it does have implications. Andre, you made mention of the fact that could this be still having relevance under WTO compliance requirements or even under UNFCCC? And this particular point indeed has competitiveness, implications, and as such will be discriminatory, and will raise all sorts of legalities. There are some papers in which it has been extensively, presented the extent to which CBAM falls short of meeting, the WTO requirements. So too is the case on the side of UNFCCC, where you deal largely, and you've been leading these discussions on response measures. This is a response measure, it's unilateral in nature, and as such, it's not extensively, so well received as you projected in your takeaways, where you check how will parties, react to this. My sense and view is that parties are likely to react, negatively, to CBAM, because discussions in themselves have an intent ultimately. An intent, they signal an intent, to be executed or carried out, in future. We may discuss, but the direction to which we discuss has in it, the end point, which deals with implementation, of CBAM. And in that light, I think we are likely, to push back, strongly on CBAM, especially given the current geopolitical, circumstances that we are faced with. Then lastly, the relationship to IRA, that has been, raised up. Again, that may be having implications on the implementation of CBAM, and one would ask, why would this be only, be accommodative to IRA only? Because countries are not at the same level, of progress in terms of deploying the various instruments and policies on climate action. And CBAM by its nature, maybe that point, let me say last, but in relation to IRA, why can't, other countries be accommodated in terms of their own policies? Because we're not necessarily, at the same, level. And then lastly, this parallel you pointed at of having to stop, the clock on international, aviation. What parallel can we draw from there? Yes, it was back in 2012-13, and at the time, the discussions under ICAO, International Civil Aviation Organization, had not matured to an extent that, and as such, when that led, to a fruitful, outcome, under ICAO in terms of that discussion, it was logical that, there be a stoppage then on the unilateral, application of including of aviation under EU ETS at that time. I think even in this context, in my view, now that we have Paris Agreement, and now our lives and circumstances in our economies have been compounded now by the current geopolitical and economic dynamics that are unfolding. It may be necessary that, because if we cry inflation now, CBAM will only serve to escalate it further. And I would submit to that proposition that says that maybe let's stop the clock, on CBAM. The time to stop the clock on CBAM is now. We nonetheless have committed on the basis of NDCs, and CBAM itself, will downplay that spirit and that sense of ambition that was, as the last presenter, pointed out, I think it was Aaron, that those have been nationally determined, and now CBAM will come as though, or will pitch as though it's deciding or imposing on countries, policies, on climate action. In our case, the key sectors that are likely to suffer, and these are labor absorptive, it's the iron and steel, cement, aluminum and articles, thereof, fertilizers, electricity, and these are the sectors that are exactly, targeted, under CBAM. Restricting these in terms of CBAM will have a bearing in terms of jobs, and we view this process, as more of a transition. And we appreciate in terms of the paper, in terms of the likely support, if CBAM really does happen ultimately. Thanks. That is my submission at this point. Back to you, Andre. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thanks a lot. Let's move on to Nigel and then Maria Elena. Nigel?
Well, thank you very much for including me in this fascinating discussion. I read the paper with interest. Congratulations to the authors. I found the paper to be clear and the presentations today as well and insightful. And I'm very pleased to add my thoughts. I just want to start by saying that I am aligned with what European policymakers are trying to do, but I'd like to offer some thoughts about how to build on the paper to reorient the European discussion potentially to adjust to these changing or evolved international circumstances. So first, just to emphasize points of agreement, I absolutely believe that success on climate change requires using all of the tools that we have, and that we need to find a way to harmonize trade policy and climate policy in a way that has not occurred yet. I also feel that we are unlikely to do that in the time required. We have so little time to be able to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement that seeking a multilateral system on either through the WTO or through the UN climate negotiations is unlikely to produce a consensus outcome quickly enough. And therefore, I'm sympathetic that Europe, which is both leading on climate change and has been for a long time, is concerned about the potential environmental effectiveness of its policies, and particularly the risk of leakage, and also the risk of an unfair playing field and competitiveness concerns and the potential offshoring of energy-intensive trade-exposed industry. So I am very much support the spirit of what Europe is trying to do. But I do think circumstances are different now, and that one should step back and think perhaps about first principles about how best to align trade and climate policies. From an environmental standpoint, the planet, the atmosphere doesn't care whether countries have a particular type of policy. What matters is that goods are made in a manner that do not harm the climate, and that international trade is structured to favor the flow of green and clean goods rather than dirty goods. So we need to think about the embedded carbon content of a product is perhaps a better measure of whether that trade on that product is helpful to achieving our climate goals or harmful, rather than the policy that the country of origin has adopted. So we should be looking at goods and not policies is my first recommendation. I also agree with the idea that this is consistent with the spirit of the Paris Agreement, as Aaron said. The premise of the Paris Agreement is that countries will be pledging outcomes, but they have total flexibility about how to achieve those outcomes. And so for European policy to have a preference towards a single type of policy doesn't seem to be matched with the international consensus about how countries should be proceeding. I would also agree with the previous speaker that an insistence on a particular type of policy is unfair, not only to developing countries for the reason he said, but even to the world's wealthiest countries. Let's look at 2 G7 countries. Japan operates through voluntary action by industry. There is no policy. The industry negotiates in consultation with the government and takes measures. Those voluntary agreements have a very strong track record of being enforced, but there is no government policy. So to insist on policy would be unfair to Japan. We've already heard that the US is taking a very different approach. I think it's very unlikely that there will be a carbon price in the United States at the federal level in the near future, and therefore there is not only the potential of pretty significant political disagreement, but also some broader fairness questions to keep in mind with respect to both developed and developing countries. I would also note that if we think about the larger geopolitical trends, where we're moving away arguably from a pure globalization model to one where we are trying to strengthen our relationships with countries that share our values, and that we're seeking to create interdependence with allies and be less vulnerable to autocrats, then the CBAM imposes some kind of friction on that system, where we should be seeking to make sure that it's potentially creating friction with the very allies that geopolitically we're trying to align with. So I think for those reasons, there is a different approach that would be better, and that, in my view, would be one that looked at that measured the carbon embedded in a good that is in international trade, and that countries should be encouraged to adopt policies to exclude products that are highly polluting, to potentially impose border adjustments or other standards on products that are somewhat polluting, but not up to the high standards that are required to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement, and that a system could be negotiated or agreed upon, at least principles for a system could be agreed at a political level among like-minded countries who are working towards ambition. And in fact, I would say that this year's G7 process, where Japan is the host and is very interested in promoting green trade. And it provides an opportunity to take stock of whether the G7, as a first step towards a broader plurilateral approach, could agree on new principles. How would this, if you could imagine a G7 agreement, and I think one could, because all the G7 leaders at the moment are in favor of strong climate action, we could imagine a set of principles where there would be more effort to measure and monitor and verify what the embedded carbon content is in goods, and that's building on the work that the good work that the OECD is doing. And that this transparency would then lead to some kind of standard setting by a broader group of countries, perhaps that could be all the OECD, it could be a group of leadership countries that included developing countries. I don't think it's likely wouldn't work in a purely global level, because unfortunately there are major economies who actually oppose the very idea of harmonizing trade and climate policy. So we have to recognize that we're by necessity in a plurilateral context. So that's what I would recommend. In terms of how that gets implemented within the current CBAM legal context, others would be more expert at analyzing that than I am, as I'm not an expert in European law. But just conceptually, one could imagine a safe harbor that would allow goods to come into European markets if those goods met an internationally negotiated standard. And that standard then could be a substitute for the country of origin having a particular policy. One could also be more radical and repeal the CBAM and replace it with a more goods-oriented approach. I think either would work, as long as clean goods can flow cleanly, regardless of what policies are in place in a particular country. So finally, I'll just conclude by saying I was really struck by the observation of our first commentator, who said that 10 years ago, we were talking about whether to take climate action, and now we're talking about what kind of action to take. I think that's exactly right. She asked, well, where will we be in 10 years? And let me just offer a possible thesis. I think we'll spend the next 10 years figuring out how countries who are serious about taking climate action can ensure that their policies are not frustrated, and that their companies and industries are not unfairly harmed. And it's really about, the next 10 years will be about how to make sure that we are conditioning our trade and our security arrangements on adequate climate action from our major partners. And that's needed both to achieve a strong environmental outcome, but it's also needed in order to sustain climate action from a political and economic standpoint. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Nigel. I think that your experience in state and climate change negotiation comes through this, through your intervention. Maria Elena. Now, are you going to blast out all the water, or you're going to be nice to us?
I'm always nice, as a rule.
The smile.
And if for those who don't know me, I am the director in charge of CBAM in the Commission, among other things. And it was very interesting to see your findings. We of course don't live into a glass bubble, so we know what's happening. We see it. Nobody could foresee it. But there are a number of pragmatic remarks that I would like to make. First of which being that the Commission has delivered its proposal. And it's now in the hands of the co-legislators, the Parliament and the Council. And regardless of the fact that the war has been going on for some months, the inflation is well known. The IRA is a relatively new aspect, but we will be able to see on the 8th of the next trilogue how it will be taken. But until now, no one contested the fact that there will be a CBAM. And CBAM has a stop the clock inside itself already. It was built in inside CBAM. It would only start 3 years after, and 3 years that would end with a review, with an assessment. If there would be a catastrophe in paper, because no money would be taken by anybody, we would always be able to have a look at it and see where it brought us. But for the moment, even though we are just only honest brokers in the debates that is taking place within the trilogues, we analyzed all the different aspects. We think that it's very useful to ask ourselves the question that you ask yourself in the document. But for the moment, we concluded that CBAM does not need to be changed for a number of reasons that I could go on. I could confute all the different slides, but I think that there were a lot of words that have already been said. If there are specific questions, I'll be happy to reply. The final remark is that, in fact, CBAM is just a consequence of the disappearance of free allowances in the ETS. So if that is not going to happen, there is no reason why CBAM should exist. But if there will be finally the elimination of free allowances, CBAM has to exist exactly to protect you. Although this verb is not really popular because it's not meant to be a protectionist measure. Let's say, to put again on the same footing what we are applying inside the EU and what we are importing from outside the EU. That is well known. So I think that the main aspect of all this debate is in the ETS and what is going to happen to it. And according to what will be decided on that table, we will follow suit. The final aspect, maybe really final, is the IRA. I have my personal doubts, please don't quote me, of whether this could be really compatible. We have been taking extra care in designing everything inside the proposal and in guiding the legislators not to give the slightest suspicion of being WTO incompatible. I read on a slide that we need to be brave, yes, but not reckless. And what we have is that on the first suspicion of incompatibility, we would have retaliatory measures. In a way, we don't really, it's not the biggest issue whether we are or not compatible with WTO. There would still need to be an analysis by the WTO itself. But what would happen, and we have already seen it, is that there would be immediate retaliation measures. Would we retaliate towards an IRA that basically discriminates the outside companies? I am not the one to decide. I'm just seeing what was published. I take note. From our point of view, I can only say that this huge effort is going to decarbonize somehow, and this decarbonization will be reflected at the border in the CBAM adjustment. So for us, this is the main issue. We are not the ones who have to see what to do on a political plan, from the political point of view, to respond to what has been just adopted. I think there will be some reaction at some point, maybe behind closed doors, but I didn't see any official reactions so far. Well, I could go on. It's very rich. The discussion is extremely rich. The slides were very interesting. I hope it will be possible to have them after the meeting. I don't want to prolong too much the discussion, but if there is any specific point that you would like to solicitate me on, I'm at your disposal.
Thank you, Maria Elena, very much. I think, at least speaking for myself, and I think from the discussion that we had, was the fact that we regard this paper as very much opening the discussion, the next chapter after the trilogue ends. And many of the issues that are here, I said, we're looking at the future, the fact that there's going to have to be some reconciliation at some point, whether in this CBAM or some other CBAM or who knows whatever, but at some point there's going to have to be, and maybe this commission or this committee that is being put together is a start in that process. But Sam.
Andre, thank you. And well, thank you for allowing me to have the last thoughts here. I'm humbled to come after the commission. Just adding some thoughts here. And first of all, thanks for the invitation. Congratulations with the good work and your ERCST tenacity to stick at this and do all the deep dives into the multiple issues surrounding this policymaking discussion. I think I'd like to start with maybe throwing some spanners in the works on the 10-year consensus, which seemed to emerge. 10 years ago was 2012. I think by then the Commission had already published its low carbon roadmap, it was called at the time. First IPCC report 1990. I mean, in the cinemas here in Brussels in 2006, Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth movie was already airing. Prime ministers were watching that across the continent and globally. We knew 10 years ago, I mean, there was no question anymore for anybody looking at the science. And I think I want to take that also back to the evolving circumstances situation we're discussing here right now, because it is important to see how some of the difficulties, and I fully agree with the challenges outlined in the report, how some of the difficulties European industry face today, how some of them would have been prevented if we had done more in the past. And it's not to put sour grapes on the table after the fact, but the no regret measures on renewable energy, energy efficiency have been there for a very long time. And they would have been win-win had we done more in the past. I think it is important at the same time today to realize we're in a fossil gas crisis. I don't think we're in a CO2 price crisis. If you look at the CO2 pricing component of the energy price in Europe, this is very small. And even Commission President von der Leyen made very clear remarks on that at the end of August. And I think I consider us also here as carbon pricing community, I think we do have some obligation to make that as clear as we can. But I mean, looking at the report, I mean, there's a lot of merit, and I learned a lot from looking at the details of the IRA Act in the US, focusing on that announcement. I think it's really helpful. You use this mainly as an argument to say, well, we need to also scale up the financial support for European industries and the green transition, let's say on this continent. The NGO community, I don't think I speak only for Carbon Market Watch here, would fully agree with that. I mean, the need to scale up support, public and private, going to industrial clean project, breakthrough technologies, etc., is very much needed. But really, when you go into the details on the export rebates in the sector, in the paper, it's a pretty depressing read, enumerating all the negative forces on industry. To me, it gives the impression there's somehow no appreciation, or there's been no assessment of all the funds already available and being allocated in the European Union for recovery, Repower EU, the winter package, the billions of state aid, indirect cost compensation allocated by member states. It's all there. It's all been public resources, and whether they have served the benefit or not, I mean, you can have a detailed look at that. I think that needs to be factored in. I think that industries are receiving support. They will continue to receive support. We do hope that this serves to also drive the climate transition in those sectors. I mean, when referring to the trilogue negotiations ongoing, there is a lot of scope to, well, to do more good or to do more bad, I would say. If you look at the Innovation Fund, carbon contracts for differences, also recovery and resilience facilities, there's potential to do more. And the CBAM sits at a very interesting position in this discussion, because keep in mind, any CBAM implementation which leads to a phase out of free emission allowances frees up more resources to invest in those clean technologies. So, I mean, and depending on which position we look at in the trilogue negotiations and the co-legislators, there is potential to scale up the innovation fund or to scale it up even more significantly. And I think that needs to be done, and it needs to serve the longer term climate goals as well. So I think that also helps to maybe add another layer on breaking through that dichotomy between pricing versus investments. I think Europe has an important example where carbon is priced and it can be smartly invested into the solutions. And I'm sure there's scope to do more there. If I have one more minute, just a few words on the international dimension here, as we're approaching COP27 in Egypt soon. The paper really lists a lot of interesting arguments in favor and against of crediting non-carbon pricing policies. I hear Mr. Sterecki very clearly. I think that the jury is still out there, and this risks to be a bone of contention. Also here, the European policymaking process offers some opportunities. I think what the European Parliament has in terms of making sure the CBAM revenues can also serve a purpose of equity and fairness in targeting towards most impacted developing countries. I think that's an important one to show that Europe is serious about these equity principles underlying the Paris Agreement. And I'll leave it with that. I'm looking forward to the exchange. Thank you.
Very good. Look, we're Aaron, I don't know whether you pressed the button or you pressed the wrong button, but you have your hand up.
I don't think I have my hand up.
It wasn't a hand up, it was an arrow. Sorry about that. Anyway, but if you want the floor, happy. But also to those in the virtual audience, as well as those that in the room, those in the virtual audience, please raise your hand, electronic hand. Those in the room, you have the advantage they're here and it's easy to see you. So who wants to go first? And maybe someone that wants to react to somebody's intervention first. I'm looking around. I mean, come on, guys. Olivier.
I'm quite impressed because, I mean, I think that the French president has read your paper yesterday.
Why? Had it been directly delivered to him? I mean, then I'm impressed with myself.
No, you were nominated. But there were an interview of the French president yesterday, and he said that we need to do like the US to implement the IRA mechanism, not to be naive and give incentive to the EU industry only. So, I mean, that it's the perfect timing. I don't know what you have done, but I mean, you have sent that to the French president
Directly.
It was yesterday, and it was at, let's say, 9 p.m.
Oh, that just after we finished the paper.
Yeah, I'm quite impressed by that.
Okay, well, thanks a lot for that. I will not claim a direct line to President Macron, but happy to take the attribution.
But that's meaning that what you are describing in your paper is floating in the air. There is a lot of political, let's say, willingness in order to obviously, for this time being, keep the industry in Europe and using, let's say, all the instruments, even if they are not consistent with what we have done before. And at the same time, yesterday in the paper, BASF declared to reshape his business presence in Europe. To switch from Europe to China because they have the possibility to get to invest in a big installation using green product or using green, let's say, resource. I mean, that was an official communication. I could imagine that there were two information. I mean, the first, let's say, regarding this reaction of the French presidency, but French are always protective. But on the other hand, the German industry has already taken a decision to move from Europe to China.
We don't have a BSF. We had BSF in the room today, but we don't have one today. Kimberly.
Thanks. I just want to add a perspective to make sure that when we talk about coexistence or conflict, we're clear or we zoom in, because I think the IRA approach is interesting. It's interesting how the French president has reacted. And several speakers have pointed out the extent to which Europe does already have some form of support and incentives for decarbonization. But I think where there is the risk of conflict is the extent to which the IRA conditions Buy America and local content requirements. And Aaron will be filing that IRA's local content requirements. But that's actually where we will see the risk of WTO disputes and retaliation. So I think we should be clear that there's perhaps an area where, if we're looking at this evolving context, maybe we have CBAM and the EU can do, Europe can do better on the incentives it provides to decarbonization. We can have that conversation. That's a healthy conversation to have. Where there's a need for perhaps greater international collaboration and discussion and holding that space and avoiding conflict is around the way that local content requirements are used in such programs and policies. So we should just be very clear on where there is that risk of conflict. And I think one thing I thought was interesting was that earlier this year, there was this sort of temporary waiver that the Biden administration put out on requirements in new infrastructure legislation. So maybe there will be some stop the clock on certain LCRs as well. Goes both ways on stop the clock, I think.
Maria Elena?
Speaking about support, I would also just like to say that, as you have probably heard, because this has been floating around as well, it's true that the current innovation fund is not enough and is not efficient, but through that mechanism, revamped with the necessary funds and the necessary efficiency tools, we can support the industry to green the production, which it's what the IRA is doing. So what we don't say is we say buy only you, that we are not going to say. And if there is anybody who is establishing even from a third country in Europe and wants to profit, the same will apply. So this is something that has already been said. That's why I'm not really shocked or worried by something like the IRA, if you look at it, practical impact.
There is, I'll come to you in a second, but and I don't want to be the one interjecting. I just raise the issue and people will address them as they see fit. That's what chairs do in principle. But there is that issue that you raised, the fact that the IRA, they could have chosen another name, but the IRA has a certain target, which is the local content. But if I were a European industry, which I'm not anymore, I'm doing other things these days, the massive amounts that come into the IRA compared to what we do in Europe is also, it's got to be a concern. I mean, if I were an operator, that's something, because the amounts are disproportionate in a way. I mean, we're focusing.
But that happens in Europe too. In Europe too. Look at Germany. The massive amount of money that that country was able to give to combat the energy crisis. The other countries were not able to do that. That's, I'm afraid, that's life. Who has more money uses
globally for developing countries.
Thank you very much, Andre.
Can you just quickly
my name is Jarosław Pietas. I'm working for Martens Center here on issues like CBAM and things, but I have been formerly involved in council work on climate, energy, transport, and telecom, and this type of thing, environment. So I was observing, for example, a process before. What I wanted to say, I first want to congratulate you because it's a wonderful work, but I wanted to say my recent participation in a WTO public forum, where there has been plenty of discussions on American approach, which was considered as something that by American is much more important for trade rules. And that's, I agree with you that this component. CBAM was not so much exposed, but however, there were a number of elements also mentioned in this context. And there are plenty of things which are much more technical, which are not really looked until now. For example, one of the presentations was looking at how much CO2 is contained in a product. What Nigel was saying, how much CO2 is contained in a product. In a in a study done by, I think, Harvard, the lady has been presenting it. She was saying that in ETS, we consider something like 3.5 times less CO2 in production of compared to a system which is applied in California. So in California, they would say it's much more CO2 emitted because they have a different methodology applied. So one has to look also at this practicality. But my question here is two questions that I have. One is the question of comparing efforts by member states, which might lead to some elements of taking into account into CBAM, and comparing levels. Because if you would say, okay, country is doing a huge effort, but still per capita CO2 emissions are very high, and then you do not apply CBAM, for example, I think you would say that, it's not yet the case, but then you get suddenly the question, who would pay CBAM? All those countries who are not making an effort. However, these countries are also having lower emissions per capita and probably, but that's a maybe more philosophical question. The second thing is observations about this stop the clock moment. I have been involved in the preparation of the EU position towards in ICAO at that time. And I could see the clash of two worlds. World of people which deal with climate. For them, it is very clear what has to be done. And the world of technical people dealing with aviation. And they are looking at it so totally different. It's a different philosophy and different approach. When I look at the WTO and climate approach, I would say WTO looks at the product. And so it's on the level of product. Whereas we are speaking about a system by states and effort by states. For WTO, it is not something which is counted. When you've got a product crossing the frontier, you look at the elements of the product, like products, similar products, or whatever, but you look at the product level, and because measures are applied to the product. If there is something which makes this product different because the state policy is different, that's a much more complicated thing. So again, you've got a clash of two philosophies, which may need probably some time to be resolved.
Thank you. Let me go to Peter Bocek first, because Peter, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Andre, and thanks for the excellent report. We, as the chemical industry, we are currently experiencing really a tectonic shift because from being a major exporter with some 40 billion trade surplus every year, we are now turning into a net importer. And this is not due to the carbon cost, this is not due to CBAM perspective, but what we miss a little bit, or what I miss in the EU procedures, is understanding what's going on and really reacting to it more quickly. There is a certain inertia in the procedures, from my point of view, that we carry on like a super tanker with policies that were conceived in good times when there was no crisis, there was not even COVID. And now we have a world in turmoil, and this will last for the coming years. So I ask myself, is there enough flexibility, enough mental fastness to anticipate what's going on and to react more quickly? Because what I feel is the thing is going on, continuing with the same arguments, with the same input. The Commission is insisting on its approach, and then you have the Parliament and the Council. And while this all is slowly progressing, the world is upside down outside of the building, outside of the Brussels bubble. Thank you.
So a very quick intervention from you. Just introduce yourself, if you don't mind, and then I'll go to Michael, and then we'll do a last round with the speakers, just their kind of last final intervention. But so.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Saul Rubens. I work for a steel trading company that has its base in the UK, but we import via third countries into the EU. And my question, if you like, is really directed at Maria Elena in her role, if I heard correctly, as the director of CBAM. I've done a lot of research and I've found a few people at the Commission who could possibly help us, but we have no idea how we're supposed to be registering as an authorised declarant. We have no idea if there's one central authority or 27 different member states. We know that there's a trilogue going on the 8th of November and then another one afterwards, but the scope still hasn't been fully done. And I was just wondering, because I've done a lot of research and I've actually used ERCST's website to get a lot of information, so thank you very much. But I was wondering, how is there somewhere that we can actually go and find all this information, please? Or should I just drop you a direct email and hopefully go on from there?
We'll get to that, but my sense is premature.
Absolutely.
That would be my short answer if I can help.
Oh, please.
Michael, that you last intervention from you, and then I'll start in reverse order, and I'll let you again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Andre, and thank you for the author's excellent report and good discussion. Michiel van Dessel, I work for ExxonMobil. So I'd just like to add kind of a Europe industry perspective here, and could spend a long time debating with Sam on his analysis of funding and how that impacts industry. I won't do that here. We can do that separately, maybe if there's appetite for that. But I just want to offer, if you are an international investor and you are keen to invest in a decarbonization project, you have the choice today to invest that money in the US, where you will get a net accretive benefit, no cost of any emissions associated, but just a net accretive tax credit. You will have the ability to produce a low carbon project, which is great news for the world. You can then choose to either export that project to Europe and benefit from the CBAM because you have low carbon intensity, which is again great and absolutely the right thing to do. And you're competing there basically with a potential investment in Europe, where you will invest to help offset or avoid a cost that you would otherwise face. That same producer in the US can also choose to send his products to other markets in the world, where he would then have a subsidized product that and European industry is then expected to compete with that without any abatement for their full cost of carbon, right? Because the free allowances would have disappeared and the CBAM will not have an export component. Now, if I'm an investor and I want to do the right thing for the world, I have those two choices. Both may abate the same amount of emissions, but it's quite clear which investment will have the higher return, right? So I do think that with everything that's going on, this warrants some rethinking. When I hear Ms. Copio say that, yes, being brave, yes, but being reckless, no, in the context of potential retaliation, I can follow that, but wouldn't it be reckless to throw the European industry under the bus, if you will, by losing its export competitiveness in such an obvious way? And I guess then the question is, which is deemed the bigger risk? The retaliation under WTO rules, which, as we have just said, may not be fit for purpose today to kind of balance trade and decarbonization? Or do we feel hostage to those rules, but then model for a solution for EU industry? I think that's a concern.
Okay, let's go on reverse order. We've got 10 minutes. We have a couple of minutes from each. Sam, you start.
Yeah, thanks. One thought, and then one concluding remark. One thought on stop the clock and the way that went in 2012, 2013. I've never seen a co-decision process going so fast in the EU institutions. It was really unprecedented. After the fact, a lot of this was documented by the colleagues at Transport and Environment, and I think the interesting thing, I mean, at the surface there was the coalition of the unwilling governments strongly opposing the EU's approach to pricing aviation pollution. But below the surface, I mean, the T&E colleagues looked at the document properties and who wrote them, and it was US aviation industry instigating those governments to start to oppose this. So I think in the political economy, that's also something to keep in mind in the CBAM discussions, and it is good we are discussing this with multinational companies around the table. A second point, I think, is the question whether ultimately, I mean, it becomes a bit of an existential discussion here. Is the CBAM a help or a hindrance? And I think it is important to still be able to distinguish some of the shorter term price crunch, geopolitical conflicts with a longer range climate crisis, which is still raging out there. And I mean, there is a chance offered to European industry at the core of the European Green Deal to find alternatives to the carbon leakage measures we have in the EU ETS, the free allowances, the state aid for indirect cost compensation, and to find those alternatives in a timely manner. I fear if you squander this opportunity, by rendering the CBAM an instrument which kind of sits there, but which doesn't do very much in the coming decade at all, the time will still come when the carbon budget runs out. And that last emission allowance, it won't matter anymore whether it's auctioned or whether it's handed out for free. And I think that's the long range challenge we still need to keep in mind, and not only have the shorter term, perhaps more instinctive reactions overtaking this debate right now. Thank you.
Thanks, Sam. Nigel?
Just in view of the shortness of time, I'll pass on the opportunity for a last comment. I've really enjoyed the discussion so far, though. Thank you.
Mr. Steleki, are you there?
Oh, yes, I'm here. No, thanks. I'll also save you time. I appreciate the richness of the views that have been shared here and the opportunity given. I think we each are able to reflect and learn from this exercise. Thank you so much. Back to you.
Michael, this sounds like a US Republican convention, the great state of whatever passes. Nathalie?
Yeah, well, thank you so much. I think that for me, it was very interesting discussion, and really glad to have here all the point of views. I think that OECD is playing best supporting actors in this discussion, and will continue to monitor countries' mitigation policy landscape at the granular level and help to inform the discussion and the policy design. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Well, we'll see you at the Oscars. Kimberly?
Thanks, and also thanks to all the speakers. It was very thoughtful discussion. My appeal is for bringing this conversation to the WTO, whether in that multilateral CT format or the plurilateral that's there. Why? Because I think while the bilateral conversation on the IRA, or that committee that's been set up, or whether they have some kind of discussion around CBAM and its accessibility and exemptions for the US, fine, that's a nice bilateral conversation, but ultimately this conversation needs to be had in a slightly wider format because the Paris Agreement, because otherwise we do leave out vast swathes of the world that need to have development opportunities, that need to trade with these economies. And if standards are set by just the US and the EU, it will not be tenable in the Paris Agreement context. So the place to have the conversation on avoiding commercial conflict with your climate mitigation measures is in the WTO, to be inclusive, set parameters, set principles, set guidelines. Still think those policies can be pursued, but there can perhaps be some guardrails set so that we don't get that commercial conflict. Thanks.
Maria Elena, the Commission has the last word.
No, I just wanted to reply to the questions that have been made, maybe just starting, first of all, with the gentleman who was asking where he asked to find information. CBAM is still under discussion. Nothing is decided until everything is decided. Then there will be a substantial period before it enters into force, because it has to be prepared. Then there will be a transitional period of at least 3 years. You will have all the information by then. But now, I have no idea. It's in the hands of the co-legislators. Coming back to what was said by the representative of the chemical industries, you say that the EU doesn't react quickly enough. Frankly, I strongly disagree. We had COVID, which sparked the Next Generation EU. We had the massive vaccination campaign with the purchase of the vaccines being bought by the European Union, just to name this. You say things have been adopted before COVID. No, CBAM was adopted last year, so not so long ago. What really didn't change, and all this was done with a sort of unanimity rule, and not to mention also the recent energy gas price cap, which was a quite difficult decision to make, because it's not the Commission who decides. The Commission can only propose. It's the member states that are slow to agree with each other what is the best way. And notwithstanding this, we still reacted relatively soon. What has not changed is the environmental need, are the rules on environmental crisis, because that is something that didn't change. That is something which is still there. And you clearly have these two problematics. Do I eat or do I care for the environment? That's like the egg today or the chicken tomorrow. You may eat today and maybe your children will not have a mouth if you don't really care. We cannot save the world alone. We don't have the money of the US. That was something that we welcome on that with the impact on the decarbonization, but clearly we would like to be able to support our industry in the same way. That money isn't there. That, as I said already, that game has to be played on the ETS allowances table, and this answers to the second question. But if the day will come that there won't be free allowances anymore, be happy if there is a CBAM. Otherwise, that's not even going to protect you from that. This being said, that was a little bit of a bomb in a pond, of a stone in a pond, the American initiative. Let's see how our political masters will react. I believe in my instrument, and I believe that somebody has to start to change something, because otherwise nobody will ever do anything because of the of other needs. We would not have closed the mines of carbon, of coke, if we were listening to only to that. We need to find the right balance, though, that I understand. That's what we keep trying every day. And it's a bit frustrating to always hear the Commission should, the EU should. Stick to your own member states, because they are their first enemy sometimes.
Fair enough. Very good. Listen, I think that we've tried to put things on the table for discussion. The role of the think tank is to ask questions, to open doors, to open perspectives. And again, thanking my colleagues, Michael and Aaron, but also the other people that have contributed, Pauline and Bente, have contributed quite tremendously to this series of papers. It's, I mean, we commit to 4 papers, and in the end, you say, what the heck did we do here? Because it's, especially to come back from vacation, you got 2 papers in 2 months. It can be fun, can tell you that. But I was fortunate to work with very good friends and very capable people. Now, what we will do, we have in this space, if you want to call it this space, we have 2 initiatives that are coming up. One will be a continuation of our work on CBAM, and the other one is a program that is funded by the State Department that deals with the climate and trade nexus, and that is something that is a 3-year program that is starting now. And this is something that Nathalie will talk to you guys just to make sure that we work together, not duplicate and not work at cross purposes. So always pleased to come to Paris and meet with my friends in Paris. And my South African friends will see you in a week in Sharm el Sheikh, I guess. And with this, I want to thank everybody that was here and look forward to working with all of you in the future. In the end, it's not an easy thing. As you said correctly, and we've been saying this for a long time, I think we're running out of free allocation. Something's going to have to give, and everybody says that they want to be green, but how the heck do we do that? So it ain't an easy thing, you know, CBAM, but again, what the CBAM looks like is also not an indifferent proposition. But again, thank you very much, those that stayed on TV and those that stayed in the room. Have a nice rest of the day.
Thank you.
Bye.
Cheers.
Bye-bye. Thank you so much.
Thanks for taking the time again.
Pleasure.
No, I appreciate it. Gracias.